Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley did a CNN town hall, and I want to walk through some notable moments from this. Before we jump into the first, the takeaway, as you'll probably pick up on as we go through some of these clips from this CNN town hall with Nikki Haley, for me was, even though she's portrayed, especially by the mainstream media, as kind of a more moderate candidate, more reasonable than the other Republicans. And she obviously is more reasonable than Trump, but that's a very low bar. She represents just how far the GOP has gone, that this is considered more moderate, that she's considered a more reasonable Republican, because she's not reasonable, as we'll get to. And she's having to, even if she doesn't believe it authentically herself, perpetuate dangerous and dishonest talking points just to have a shot within the modern Republican primary field, even though she doesn't really have a shot, but she's trying to, and that's really unfortunate. So we'll start with this, her getting asked, what's your definition of woke?
Woke, the word woke, used to be used by progressives to talk about an awareness of inequities and historical inequities. But obviously it means something else to conservatives criticizing it. What does it mean to you? How do you define woke?
There's a lot of things. I mean, you want to start with biological boys playing in girls' sports. That's one thing. The fact that we have gender pronoun classes in the military now. I mean, all of these things that are pushing what a small minority want on the majority of Americans, it's too much. It's too much. I mean,
For her to be talking about a small minority of Americans pushing their will onto the majority, that's rich.
The irony is profoundly thick, given that that is basically the position of the Republican Party writ large with its entire agenda. Every single major piece of Republican policy, if you want to call it that, is supported only by a minority of the American public. If you want to reflect the majority's values and the majority's policies, you got to vote Democrat. So in her own way, she made an affirmative case to vote Democrat. Who knew?
And because their policies just are not as popular as Democratic policies, are not as supported, because often they work to make the wealthy more wealthy, the powerful more powerful. Because of that fact, they have to obsess over wokeness. They have to distract with things like wokeness. And we'll dive into this second clip. Really dangerous rhetoric here.
the idea that we have biological boys playing in girls' sports, it is the women's issue of our time. My daughter ran track in high school. I don't even know how I would have that conversation with her. How are we supposed to get our girls used to the fact that biological boys are in their locker rooms? And then we wonder why a third of our teenage girls seriously contemplated suicide last year? We should be growing strong girls, confident girls. Then you go and you talk about building a strong military. How are you going to build the morale in a strong military when you're doing gender pronoun classes? Why is it that...
Just such a lazy attempt at dishonest talking points. Really? That's the problem? The military, they're spending all this time on gender pronoun classes. And if you want to talk about sports and transgender athletes and all of that, I've said this before, I'm not interested in having a discussion about that with someone, even though you can have a good faith discussion about that subject, if they come at these subjects in such a dishonest way and such a dangerous, dehumanizing way, such as apparently they're blaming trans youth for the high suicide rate among youth generally. You heard that, right?
Yeah.
That is sickening. What on earth is she talking about? Oh, there's going to be a trans child in a locker room and that's why there's high suicide rates among children. What on earth?
Yeah, it's really bizarre because, it's trans youth, which comprises, the biggest cohort of youth suicidality, right? It's a disproportionately high cohort of people who experience suicidal ideation. So you would think her sympathy would be with them, not projecting some sort of made up issue that she says they're the cause of. And it's also kind of interesting that, for a member of a political party that's supposedly so pro-military and so pro-America, It's interesting to me that, under the Biden administration, the defense budget has only increased as it does every single year.
But it's for the gender
virtually.
pronoun classes.
Right,
only.
exactly. All those, gender pronoun classes, the textbooks that go along with it, apparently, the name tags. I mean, it's absolutely preposterous. This idea that the military, which, we spend more on defense than like the next 15 countries combined, and 13 out of 15 are our allies. This idea that whenever a Democrat is in office, we cease to be the most powerful military force in the world is absolutely preposterous. Of course, she has no facts to support any of her claims in this clip. So what can you expect?
Yeah. And then speaking of dangerous stuff, even though in the past she's criticized Trump for his lies that led to January 6th and stuff like that, even she's recognizing 63% of the Republican Republican voters believe the election of Joe Biden was illegitimate. So she is even perpetuating these talking points about 2020. Take a look at this one.
Trump. After January 6th, you said this about him, quote, "We need to acknowledge he let us down. He went down a path he shouldn't have, and we shouldn't have followed him, and we shouldn't have listened to him, and we can't let that ever happen again," unquote. Do you still feel that way?
Yes, he thinks it was a beautiful day. I think it was a terrible day. I'll always stand by that.
And Trump continues to lie about what happened in the 2020 election. He continues to say it was stolen, and a huge number of Republican voters believe him. Now, I know you have issues with the ways some states changed the rules to help people vote during the pandemic. I get that. You have acknowledged that that didn't have any impact on the outcome of the election. But I'm talking about debunked, wild conspiracy theories, claims rejected by Republican governors and election officials, more than 60 failed legal challenges. After January 6th, you said about voters who believe Trump's conspiracy theories, quote, "We've got a lot of work to do. They've been lied to by everybody," unquote. How clearly are you going to state this to voters on the campaign trail?
I think it's important that voters want to have election integrity. That's the biggest thing. And I've seen when I was at the United Nations, there's nothing worse than when a country and their citizens don't trust the election system. So when you look at what happened, you had mail-out balloting that we know was happening. We know that there was harvesting that was happening. And then you had secretaries of state that did things without approval from their legislature. Those are pretty serious. And so what we've seen happen in states is they've started to pass election integrity laws, which we need to have. And I think that's really important. And I've said all of what happened, none of that would have changed the results of the election. We know that President Biden is the president. But I do think it goes to say we need to continue to have election integrity laws. When I was governor,
that is how far the Republican Party has fallen, where even someone who previously made clear I'm against what Trump is doing and all of that has to perpetuate these same talking points. And what's the big conspiracy there? She won't go into dead voters or voting in mass and Dominion flipped votes and all of that, but she's saying because of the pandemic, some states try to make it easier to vote. Not alleging fraud took place, just saying it was easier for some people to vote, and people mailed in. She said, we knew that mail-in voting was happening and harvesting. All ballot harvesting is someone taking your ballot to the location for elderly people, for example. So the big conspiracy is more people were able to vote easier.
Yeah, I think it's important for your audience and everyone else who's watching, the Republican Party, none of its officials have any credibility on the subject of election integrity, none. The Heritage Foundation, which is this right-wing, conservative think tank, which supposedly tracks and publicly discloses instances of election denial, or excuse me, not election denial, like election fraud. If you go to their database, you'll find for every Democratic voter, you'll find one or two Republican voters who have been either convicted or have been charged with voter fraud. We had high-profile instances of that in Nevada and Florida, where Republicans would vote on behalf of dead spouses or try to duplicate ballots as well. So number one, the Republican Party, to whatever...
Let me just say quickly before you go, and they got caught, and there are very, very few examples of that, but continue.
Correct. That's what I mean. So but taking the premise at face value, the idea that the GOP has any credibility on this issue is absolutely factually untrue, number one. Number two, to whatever extent voter fraud exists, from Democratic voters, Republican voters, independents, it is a statistical minority, a blip of a blip. even in the 2020 election, with all the pandemic era accommodations that were made, mail-in ballots, the proliferation of drop-off boxes, the extent to whatever extent that ballot harvesting existed, none of these, we have not seen any evidence that saw a credible uptick in voter fraud during the 2020 election. And by the way, what's wrong with those things? Why is mail-in mail-in voting a problem, absentee voting a problem? Why is even ballot harvesting a problem? It's the equivalent of handing your homework or a test off to somebody going up to the teacher's desk to deliver their paper. You still have signature verification, all the safeguards in effect, Luke. It's not like, the envelope still has to be sealed. They still have to do all the matches. The level of fraud associated with these things is unverified. There's no evidence for it. It's a solution in search of a problem to intimidate voters to not come out.
Absolutely. And the other part of that talking point from her that just really gets under my skin is when Republican politicians will say, we just need, who are in the moment lying or being dishonest about our elections, we'll go, we just need people to trust in our elections. That's the problems. That's what I want to address. That's why we need election integrity bills to be passed. Why don't they trust right now as much as we have in the past in our elections? Because of lies like the ones falling out of your mouth right now. It's very similar to Marjorie Greene during an interview, getting asked about her lying about the election. And she said, I really do believe that the 2020 election was stolen. And it's okay for me to believe that because a lot of my voters do. Because you told them that. Because you lied to them. You can't convince someone of something, and then when asked why it's okay that you're convincing them of that, say, but they believe it, so I'm allowed to I'm just representing them. But you get the point.
No, it's completely
enraging.
circular. No, 100%. It's circular. So you peddle a falsehood incessantly, and in some cases, I think perhaps even in perpetuity, if they're allowed to continue. And then some people will find that lie persuasive, and then you cite the people that you've lied to as proof that the lie has merit. It's an absolutely circular problem, and it's something exclusive to the Republican Party. So, no credibility from Nikki Haley here, none.
And I know we have two more clips. We'll scrap the last one for time and just play this one more, the next one, as our final clip.
With how Mr. Trump dealt with and how his attitude was towards Kim Jong-un while you worked at the UN.
I mean, Kim Jong-un is a thug. And if you see what he has done to his own people in North Korea, when money went to North Korea, it didn't go to feed their people. It went to feed their nuclear program. There's nothing good or decent about Kim Jong-un. There's no reason we should ever congratulate the fact that they are now vice chair of the World Health Organization. And it goes to the fact that also the World Health Organization is a farce to start with. We saw that during COVID.
So it did bother you, and you didn't like his congratulating of Kim Jong-un, and you didn't like how he dealt with him when
I don't think we ever should congratulate dictators. Congratulate our friends. Don't congratulate our enemies. It emboldens them when we do that.
So I guess that's her criticizing Trump. But even there, she won't say, no, he should not have done that or anything like that. It has to be, well, I don't think anyone should. But clearly showing some difference, I guess, on that one from Trump. Because normally her big line is, I don't kick sideways when she's asked about Trump. I just want to talk about Joe Biden. Well, you can't talk about Joe Biden until you defeat the people in the primary. Yeah,
I'll say this. I mean, it's the same sort of tepid, quasi roundabout criticism that we're starting to see from the candidates as they proceed. And we talked about this before. The big problem with this is that, if you're competing against Donald Trump has convinced the Republican base that his personality is one of strength. So even though we know that he is a thin-skinned, malignant narcissist who can't handle criticism, all of which embodies the exact opposite of strength, he's convinced that being loud and boisterous and just relentlessly aggressive towards anybody who even any sort of criticism whatsoever. So Haley, just like DeSantis, just like Tim Scott, just like all the other competitors, I guess with the possible exception of Asa Hutchinson, who of course stands no chance whatsoever, they are not demonstrating strength by the Republican definition. So how on earth can you possibly win them over in that way? But I'll also say the idea that you don't kick sideways. This is something that the Republican Party has historically been, not so much in the modern era. We see a lot of Republican infighting for the last couple of years under the Biden administration, which is good for Democrats and the left and the country as a whole. But I will say, from just a purely political perspective, I wish we would see more of that from Democrats, this idea that, you keep your eyes on the prize pretty consistently, and whatever criticisms that you may have of your peers or members of your own party, you are very strategic about when, where, and how you articulate them. That is an advantage for the Republican Party in electoral politics, and it's something that Democrats should note, in my opinion.
Thank you so much for watching. For the outro on this video, I want to plug Josiah's channel. Hit them with it, Josiah.
Hey, everybody. I appreciate you watching. You can find me at youtube.com/@ponderingpolitics. One word, Pondering Politics. If you like progressive commentary that focuses on coalition building with other elements of the left and calling the Republican Party out for what it's become, I hope you'll view my channel. Give me a like and subscribe and some feedback. Again, youtube.com/@ponderingpolitics. Thanks again.